What if I told you that discovering just 5 specific stories could transform your family's sense of connection and resilience and their interest and excitement in family history? You don't need a complete family tree. You don't need to know every ancestor back 10 generations. You just need these 5 stories. I'm Crista Cowan. I'm the corporate genealogist here at Ancestry, and it is October 1st, which to me should be a national holiday because here in the United States, it is the first day of National Family History Month, which means I get to talk all day, every day, here with you on my Instagram, over on Facebook, all of the places. I get to talk about family history all day, every day, as if I didn't do that already. But this time I have a hook or a way to talk about family history that hopefully helps other people listen a little more, a little differently, a little better. Again, here in the United States, October is National Family History Month. So as we head into, we're in the Burr months, we're heading into holiday seasons where, for example, in November, we often get together with our families around a Thanksgiving dinner table. Coming up in December, we have different holidays that we celebrate depending on our religious and cultural beliefs. And often that involves gathering family together. As we look toward the new year, that's often a time of reflection, kind of rejiggering the way that we do things or setting new goals. And all of that season just kicks off with this National Family History Month. And I think it's a really great time to think about how the information we're collecting in our family trees and through our DNA matches lends itself to the stories that we could be telling our families. So I've identified what I think are the 5 most important stories that we can tell. I'm going to share those with you, but I'm also going to share with you ways you can both find those stories and ways you can share those stories. And then what I would love to see happen is whether you're watching this live here on Zoom or on the Ancestry YouTube channel, would you go to the Ancestry YouTube channel and leave comments as you discover these stories this month? I would love this video to be an ongoing conversation all month long. Now, of course, you can find me on social media, on Facebook or on Instagram. We can continue those conversations there. And then at the end of the month, we're going to do another virtual event that I want to be a celebration of all of the stories that you've discovered and found a way to capture and share this month. Okay, so that is what we're going to do today for our time together, is talk about these 5 stories, give you some clues or some tips for how you can discover and share them. And then let's make National Family History Month a time where we are finding, sharing, and celebrating the stories that we are discovering. Let me go ahead and share my screen. And that is always a little tricky. Well, sometimes it's a little tricky. So let me just make sure I do that correctly. There we go. And there we go. And you are seeing what I am seeing. Yes, yes, awesome. Okay, so let's talk about the first story. And the first story that you should be thinking about in your family tree is the love story. Love stories play an important role in family creation. Now, of course, we know not every family is created out of love, but love stories are an interesting way to look at who's in your family tree and how those people came together to form a family. I've referenced this before, but some of you may be new to family history, so you may not be familiar with this. There was a research study done at Emory University back in the late 1990s. It was a several years research study. They ended up publishing their findings in the early 2000s. And what they discovered was that the #1 predictor of resilience and self-esteem in children is whether or not they come from a home that has a strong family narrative. Now, there's a lot of that research that we could dig into, and I do talk about that all the time on my podcast. But I want you to think specifically about one of the things that came out of that study, which was a list of 20 questions called the Do You Know Scale. 20 yes or no questions that you ask your child, and if they can answer yes, they know the answer to that question with a high degree of, number of yeses, means they are more likely to be resilient and have self-esteem. And of course, those two characteristics lend themselves to all sorts of other benefits in life: better grades, and academic outcomes, better friendships and relationships, ultimately then leading to better career options, better marriages and families themselves. So that was the findings of this Emory University study. And the output, one of the outputs was this 20-question Do You Know scale. And the research has been continued by other organizations and other universities. And it's actually been discovered that it's not just children who benefit from knowing the answers to these questions. It's also teenagers and young adults, and ultimately even adults can gain some benefit from this. The number one question on the Do You Know scale is this: do you know the story of how your parents met? And the interesting thing about the research study out of Emory University was that it doesn't even matter if your parents are still together, or if they divorced when you were young, or if they were never married to begin with, or if they had a tumultuous relationship or an incredibly loving relationship. The key factor was, do you know the story? Because the story of how your parents met is part of your origin story and plays into your identity. And it plays into the way that things in your family have played out over time. And so here's what I would love to just do: a little quick exercise in the comments, in the chat if you're watching this live, in the comments on YouTube. If you know the story of how your parents met, can you tell it in 5 words or less? And can you do it in a way that makes me want to know more of the story? Make it a little bit of a hook or a little bit intriguing, rather than just stating the facts, which is what us genealogists love to do. As we think about becoming a family historian, how would I tell the story in a way that captures someone's attention and makes them want to know more? So I'm going to take a peek here in the chat, and we are going to see what some of you all are sharing. A buffet at a house party. Pam, I love that. A freshman university dance. That's fantastic. Dad played in the band at mom's high school dance. Not quite 5 words, Julie, but certainly an intriguing hook and makes me want to know more. Like, what instrument did he play? And did she notice him first or did he notice her first? Like, I have questions. That's a good hook. They met at their siblings' wedding. So Monique, 2 siblings married each other, and then their siblings met at the wedding. I have heard that story before. I think it's a great one. Some of you don't know, right? And I'm seeing you comment on that, and that's okay. I think it's an opportunity to learn the story. And so if your parents are still living, of course, ask them. By all means, ask them. But if your parents are not still living, who else could you ask? Do your parents have siblings living who might have been around? Or do you have older cousins who might have been alive when your parents met? Do you have old letters or diaries or things in a box that you haven't gone through yet from your parents that might give you clues to what their love story was? Can you put them in the same place at the same time? So as you think about how to tell a love story, place and time matter. I'm seeing quite a few of you talk about meeting people, your parents meeting during wartime, serving in the Air Force together. Like there's a naval hospital. I don't know who was the patient and who might have been the caregiver, or if they were both patients. Mom dropped a pencil. That's a fantastic hook. I want to know more about that. Met when making a long distance phone call. I have a feeling I might know where that is going, and that's an interesting. Met at a cafe on a dare. The baseball player falls for the princess. Daniel, you don't just have a hook, you've got a headline. That's like the beginning of a children's book. So as you think about this, my parents' story is 4-day blind date. And it's a fantastic story. I also could tell you the stories of how each of my grandparents met. My paternal grandparents, the hook is cute butt and a Diet Coke. And my maternal grandparents she was the slugger on the softball team. And so, like, there are stories to be had, and sometimes we have to go digging for them, and sometimes we have to intentionally ask questions and be curious. And sometimes the information isn't readily available to us, but we can look for other clues. So, what I want you to think about as you think about the love stories in your family tree, start with your parents, maybe even start with yourself. Do your children and grandchildren know the story of how you met their other parent or grandparent, even if you're not still with that person? Is that information that has been woven into the family narrative? And are there ways that you could share that story more readily? For people you don't know, look for newspaper articles, or look to where they were living at the time, look to what they were doing as an occupation at the time. I've found a lot of answers to how they met by looking at occupations and realizing, oh, they worked for the same company, or oh, they lived around the corner from each other, or oh, he was stationed in her town with the military, or right, like there are lots of those kinds of clues that are available. So I hope that you'll think about that and start to record that information. You can do that as notes in your family tree. So let me just show you what that looks like. Oh, let me see if I can get out of, I might have to stop sharing. There we go. Okay. So when you are in your family tree, there are a couple of different places that you can add this information based on your level of comfort sharing this information. Now, of course, information about living people in ancestry trees is always privatized. So you'll be able to see it because it's your tree. But anybody else who comes to look at your tree will just see the word private, and they won't be able to see any names or dates or places or photos or stories that you've attached to that living person solely. Okay. So I'm looking at my tree. You can see this information. Information about deceased people, of course, if your tree is public, will be publicly viewable by others on Ancestry. But you can come into any person in your family tree, and there, like I said, are a couple of ways you can add this information. First, if you want it to be completely private, you can do it as a note. Notes, I use my notes extensively. It's how I do my research and record transcription and like timelines of details. I put in to-do lists, like my research notes, my notes are a working space. However, sometimes I will draft stories in my notes that I'm not yet ready to share publicly because I want to make sure that the story is accurate. I want to make sure I have as many details as possible. And so I might draft a story in the notes to keep it private until I'm ready to share it publicly. But then I don't have to worry about what Google Doc did I put that in or where did I write that. It's all connected here to my tree. So that's the first place that you can share that story or start to craft that story. The second place is in comments. Comments are public, so anybody who can see your tree can see these comments. However, comments have limited character space, and so you have to kind of play within what is available there. Similarly, description facts are also limited in character space, but are public. So for example, I could come in here to my grandparents' marriage fact, and I could add a little descriptive information about their love story. I could also add an engagement fact. So I could come in here and I could, let's see if there even is one. If not, I can create one. So yes, there is an engagement fact. So I could add an engagement fact and add details about what I know about their love story in the description for that fact. So notes, private, write as much as you want, use it as a draft space before you're ready to make that information public. Comments, limited character space, but public. Facts that have descriptions, limited character space, but also public. And then the final place that you could share that is in the gallery. So in the gallery, one of the things that you can do is you can add or create media. So if I click to add media, I could upload a doc or a PDF that I had written the story in a page or 10 pages or however many pages it takes me to tell this story. I can then upload that document to my tree. Now, the important thing to remember about that is once you've uploaded it to your tree, it is in a static format, and anybody else that has my grandfather in their tree is going to get hinted that document or that story, and they could save it to their tree. And so we always want to just make sure that whatever we're putting out there is as accurate as possible, and that we know that that document is going to get hinted to others who have this person in their family tree. The other kind of media, in addition to a PDF file or a doc file that you could upload, is an audio file. Think about that for just a minute. I would give anything to have my grandmother's voice telling the story of how she and my grandfather met. She told me that story dozens of times, and I can hear her voice in my head when she tells it, but I failed to record that story in her voice, and it breaks my heart because that means that my nieces and nephews and my cousins who never got to hear that story from her only have my version of it in my voice. So I could still record it. As a matter of fact, I have. It was a podcast episode I did for Valentine's Day last year, where I told the love stories of my parents and grandparents. But you can upload an audio file of them telling the story or of you telling the story. And I would encourage you to do that. If you have the story somewhere else, maybe you've written it in a blog, maybe you've put it on YouTube, like I've got that podcast episode is out on YouTube. So what I should probably do is come in here and add a web link, and you can then link to wherever on the internet you have that story published, and then just create a little link name for it, like love story or how they met, whatever you want to call it. And it will then show up here at the bottom of the source column on their profile page, and anybody can then access that has access to this profile page. Okay. So again, just a quick, because I'm seeing some questions roll in, just a quick recap on public versus private. On Ancestry, a public tree just means that anyone with an Ancestry subscription can see the dead people in your tree. If they don't have a subscription, it's not open to all the internet. Public just means anybody in the Ancestry ecosystem that has a subscription can search for and find your tree, and they can see the dead people and the information about them. They will see that there are living people in the tree, but all of that information will be privatized. Private trees on Ancestry mean that people could search and they would find your tree, and we would tell them that the person they searched for is in that tree. but they wouldn't be able to view the profile page or any of the other information in the tree unless you expressly gave them permission to see that. So that's public, private, searchable, and then there is a third setting in privacy, which is private, unsearchable, which means nobody will even know your tree exists. I have a couple of those that I use for sandbox kind of work, where I don't want to have people finding information I'm not sure is accurate. But my main tree is public. As a matter of fact, any one of you right now could go search for my grandfather with this information on your screen. You could find my tree and you could see some of the ways that I am adding information, navigating the information that we're finding, and making sure that the stories are told. Okay, so those are the various ways that you can add a story to your tree so that it keeps it all in one place. I hope what you're doing with your family tree is creating this place that isn't just about information, but that it also becomes really story driven. Because what I'm discovering with my siblings after a lifetime of this, and with my nephews and the world's only niece, as I'm starting to share information with them, that stories are what capture their imagination and their interest and lead them to ask more questions. Without the stories, it's just data and they're not as interested. So the love story is the first one that Emory University recommends that we share. And I think that it is a great way for you to get started this National Family History Month. That's story number one. Story number two is the resilience story. And so here's what I want you to be looking for in your family tree this month. Look for what hard things did we survive? We meaning my people, my ancestors, the communities that I come from. What hard things did we survive? So here's, again, where I want you to lean in a little bit and participate in the chat or in the comments. Could you just make a list of some of the things that your family survived? For example, my family survived crossing oceans in unsanitary conditions, unjust imprisonment, crop failure, natural disasters, abandonment by a spouse and father. Like, we could just start making lists of all of the hard things that our ancestors survived. The reality is, every one of our ancestors survived long enough to have a child that survived long enough to have a child ultimately that led to us. And so there is something really powerful in those stories of resilience, I think, that help keep us more resilient as well. But sometimes we don't dig into the specific stories. So I can make a list of all the things my family survived, but do I know the stories of those survival? So, what I want you to think about and look for are stories of overcoming adversity, stories of perseverance, stories of stick-to-itiveness, stories of, everything being figure-outable and how they did that, stories of how they learned and educated themselves in an age where education and information was not nearly as readily available as it is today. So brainstorm some lists of things we survived, and then brainstorm some or add some names next to those of specific people in your tree who survived those things and what that story might be. Now, I'm going to give you again a brief example this time from my own tree, just so that you have some illustration of what that might look like. So way down here on my mom's branch of the family tree is a woman named Margaret Lawrence. Margaret Lawrence was born in the early 1700s in England. She died in Virginia at barely 30 years old. Actually, we think she wasn't even quite 30 years old. We suspect she died in childbirth. But the story has always been told in various ways. And so I dug in to the research to figure out what the true story was as far as we could tell. And so what you'll see here on Margaret Lawrence is that she was a convict. She was a convict transported from England to the Americas and ended up in bondage. We had always been told she was starving on the streets of London and stole bread. Nope. She was working for a wealthy woman and stole a bunch of clothes and jewelry and ended up in jail. But the reason why she found herself in those circumstances was because a year or two earlier, she had left the Church of England and her family had disowned her and she was completely destitute. And so there was some desperation there. She still made some poor choices, but she ended up in prison and then ultimately transported on a convict ship. When she arrived, her indentureship, which was basically her prison sentence, was bought by a man from Virginia who was an enslaver. He bought her and then proceeded to father at least 2 children by her in a virtually non-consensual situation. Now, all of that, pieces of that story have been told my whole life because from the 1700s, that story of her resilience in the face of everything she faced was passed down generation after generation. It's a story I grew up hearing. The facts weren't always accurate, so I dug into the records to uncover some of the facts. I dug into the DNA results in order to connect the dots between, proving that this indenture, the man who bought her indentureship, really was the father of her children. I dug into his life and all of the other things surrounding him, and then what happened to her 2 young children after she died at such a young age. So that is a story of resilience in my family tree. And you can see here, I've added a web link to a YouTube video where I share the whole story about her and share information about the records and the other things that I discovered. So you figure out how you want to share the story and what stories you want to share. But the idea is of resilience in your family tree, because those stories of resilience build confidence in you and in your children and your grandchildren that we come from people who figured it out. We come from people who survived. We come from people who made hard choices. We come from people who made bad choices. And the next generation made different choices that allowed them to continue to move forward. You start to see some of these patterns in your family tree. But my challenge to you this National Family History Month is to write those stories down in some fashion, even if it's just a line or two as a comment in your tree, or do a full-blown story that you tell or interview other people to get their take on it as well. Lots of different ways that you can approach this. The third story that every family needs to know is the values story. And this one is a little trickier, but what I want you to start thinking about and looking for as you explore the lives of the people in your family tree is, what did they stand for? What were their career choices? What was their religious community? Who did they work with and worship with? And what were the beliefs of that particular faith? As you look back in your family tree, you will see patterns of different religious traditions or cultural spiritual practices. And I want you to see if you can figure out or identify those. There was a meme that went around years and years and years ago by somebody in the genealogy community, Paul Hawthorne, if you're watching. Welcome and thank you again, because it was such a fun way to look at your family tree that I think a lot of us had never considered before. Basically, we took a blank pedigree form, and just wrote the religions instead of the names or dates or anything else in those spaces. We just wrote the religions of the people in our family tree. And in my tree, when I did that, it started to unfold a really interesting pattern when you looked at it in totality. But then I also noticed that there were religions in my family tree that I knew very little about. And it led me to explore more about them. For example, in my family tree, we have an entire branch of the tree that is Quaker. And that is not something that I knew anything about before I started exploring what is it that these people value? What is the value story here? And as I dug into it, and you're going to see way back here, I realized that, this family here was all Quaker. And then by the next generation, they were not any longer. But dug into it a little bit more and discovered that not only was this family Quaker, but way back here, this particular immigrant ancestor from England came to Massachusetts Bay Colony in the early days, was married, had a couple children, was not Puritan. As a matter of fact, at the time, he had little to no religion. And so he found himself getting in hot water a lot, in and out of prison, in and out of the stocks. They thought he was a rabble rouser, and maybe he was a little bit, because he was not connected with the particular faith of that community. So ultimately, he took his family and went back to England, had a few more children, met up with a man named George Fox, who was the founder of the Quaker faith, and joined that faith. Got put in prison in England because he was Quaker. When he got out of prison, he and George Fox designed a scheme whereby he was sent to what is now New Jersey, basically purchased most of New Jersey. And then as other Quakers joined the faith or were, got out of prison in England, George Fox would send them to Richard and Abigail, and they would set them up with property and start to build that community. And so as you get back into the early 1800s through the 1700s into the late 1600s, you're going to see a huge population of people who are of the Quaker faith in New Jersey. And that's why. And so digging into the religion of the people in my family tree who were Quaker led me actually to additional records that allowed me to identify so many more people in my family tree, because the Quaker faith, one of the things that they valued was meticulous record keeping. And so we have detailed records of every birth and marriage and death and church meeting and burial location and disputes within the community and people moving from one community to another because the church would transfer the records. And you've got such detailed information. And then ultimately led me to this story about Richard and Abigail and their role in the founding of New Jersey and the founding of the Quaker faith in America. And that tells me some things about who these people were and what it was that they valued. Interesting side note, because Richard and Abigail were in Massachusetts first, they have children born in Massachusetts. Then they go back to England and have children born in England. Then they come back to New Jersey and have children born in New Jersey. And so if you're looking at this family in the 1600s in my tree with all of these children born back and forth across the sea, you might think my information is wrong, because typically that is not logical. But in this case, it just happens to be the truth. So the value story, start looking for what it is that that your family members valued. Okay. I'm not sure why it is showing you. Let's try that again. Maybe. There we go. Okay. So careers, religious affiliations, look for things like community involvement. That also starts to say something about their values. Did they serve as the local sheriff? Were they the justice of the peace? Did they run for political office? Did they donate money to build a school or a church? Did they donate the land for the local cemetery? Did they, in spite of the fact that maybe they came from nothing, make sure that every one of their children received a college education? What is it that they valued? The clues are there, and you can make some hypotheses and even come to some conclusions based on that. I think this matters because it helps us understand the values that we inherited. And I think it helps us be more conscious about how we choose our own values going forward in the world. Because sometimes we are affected by the things that our ancestors did and the choices that they made, and they kind of just seep into our family culture. And sometimes we don't make intentional choices because we're not aware of what some of those things are. And so I think it's a really great opportunity to craft some stories around who these people were and what they believed and the choices that they made, and then how we choose to either leave some of those things behind or consciously carry them with us and into our own family culture. Okay, that's story number 3. Story number 4 in the 5 stories that all families or every family needs to know is the origin story. And the origin story can mean a lot of things, but basically it boils down to, where did we come from? So there are immigration stories, and those immigration stories run the gamut from choice to non-consensual forced migration, like in the case of my 5 times great grandmother Margaret, where she was forced to migrate. When you start dealing with individuals in enslavement, that was a circumstance of forced migration. And so you can look at that migration story and see what it helps you understand about the origins of your people. I've done a couple of Ancestry virtual events on immigration. Immigration, like after they get to the US, immigration into other countries, immigration from other countries. So if you go to ancestry.com/education, scroll down that page, you'll see our past virtual events. And there are a couple there on immigration that might be useful for you if that is information you are still looking for. There's also the concept of migration. So, in addition to immigration, which is from one country to another country, migration typically means the way that people move within a country. So, I have migration stories in my family tree in Germany. Germany, of course, not really a unified country until the 1860s. Prior to that, it was a bunch of separate kingdoms, but they were all Germanic language communities and regions. And I have a particular ancestor who was a carpenter, and he had a travel passport that allowed him to move freely through the kingdoms of the Germanic portion of Europe. Parts of it were Prussia, parts of it were Germany at the time. And so he could move around because he was a highly trained craftsman whose work was in demand. That passport also got him out of military service for a time because of the value of the craft that he was providing and the service he was providing to those communities. Ultimately, his passport no longer worked. The army wanted to conscript him. And so he got on a boat and came to America because he didn't believe in that particular cause. So in the migration story, we also get a values story. We also start to understand a little bit about what he believed or felt. And that migration factor then is what we call a push immigration. So he was migrating around the country. Now he's being pushed out of the country. And the pull factor was to come to Texas. So the German hill country of Texas was large settlement of German immigrants. And so the pull to that particular place was because of the German community there. As a matter of fact, my great grandmother, who I knew, was his daughter. She was born in Dallas. They moved up to Dallas for his work. She was born in Dallas, Texas. But to the day she died, she spoke with a German accent because she went to German school, she went to German church, they spoke German in the home. She did not learn English until she was in like grade school, like, first or second grade. And So German was her native language in her formative years. And then she met a military man in El Paso at a fair. That was how my great grandparents met. It was a military parade, and my great grandfather was on a horse looking very dapper, and she decided that that was who she wanted. Her younger sister was with her. They saw another man on a horse. They decided that was who she wanted. And these two women pursued these two men and ultimately married both of them. But then, because he was career military, the migration story becomes about how they went to Little Rock, where my grandpa's older sister was born. Then they were stationed in San Francisco, where my grandfather was born. And then ultimately they ended up in Los Angeles, where my grandfather was raised. His younger sister was born. And my great grandfather was stationed there as the head of the Army recruiting office. So you have these stories of where did we come from? And that can be what is the country of origin, or it can mean what is the migration path that we took? How did we get here? Another really great way to discover that is using Ancestry DNA. So, Ancestry DNA is an opportunity for you to learn more about the origin of your family, even if you haven't yet connected the dots through your family tree to connect with those specific places. But there is an opportunity there to explore some academic and historical information that Ancestry has built into the DNA experience that allows you to understand those places a little more deeply. And in case you haven't heard, happy National Family History Month. Next week, October 9th, is the annual Ancestry DNA Origins Update. I'll give you a sneak peek because I have been given the new update, so you can kind of see a little bit about what direction we're going with this. But my point here is I want you to explore these origins, not just look at them and move on. So here are my new, here's my new estimates based on the update. You can see we now have macro regions, and then we have micro regions. So these are smaller geographic areas within a larger geographic area. So instead of your list just being all these places from highest percentage to lowest percentage, one of the pieces of feedback that we heard from so many of you was, can you group similar places together? And then can you get more granular or more precise? And that's exactly what this update is going to do. But you can click on any one of these regions, and you'll notice here Ancestry has provided you with some additional information about that particular place. And I hope that you would be interested in exploring it at least a little bit. Okay, and so you can kind of work your way through those, get familiar with where it is on a map, start to understand again, what were the religious people, what was the predominant religion there? Did my family member belong to that religion or not? And how did that affect their life? What was the economic condition of not just my family, but of that area? And how might that have played into it? Where in the social stratosphere did my ancestors sit? And how did that affect their lives? So you can explore these regions with a little bit of a different eye when you start thinking about origins and story and what exactly that means for your particular family. The reason why origin stories matter is because it helps us build identity and it helps us build belonging. When I think about like my people are German and Irish and Scottish and English. And that is how I identify with my heritage. Now, then, I'm here in the United States and have deep colonial roots that go back. And so the migration of how those people, lived and worked and worshiped and met each other and created families and then migrated with those families that ultimately all led to me and the family that I know and love today is an important part of our origin story as a family and how we view the world. And I think understanding that is is an important part of family history. It's not just information for information's sake. I think sometimes it's also about information for informing how we move and work and worship and love and build families in the world today, how we connect with one another. Okay, the fifth and final story, maybe not the final story, but the fifth and final story today that every family should know has to do with an identity story. And really, like when you take all the things we've already talked about, this is kind of the amalgamation of all of those things. But there are, I think, some additional things we can think about, which is who am I in this family? Because one of the things we often forget to do when digging up and telling family stories is to tell our own stories, to make sure that our children and grandchildren know the story of how we met, or that our children and grandchildren understand why we chose the particular faith tradition we chose that might be the same or different than that of our parents or grandparents. I think it's important for our children to understand why we chose the career that we chose, why we, like even something as simple as like your birth story. One of the things that I love about my sister-in-law, Shelley, when she and my youngest brother got married, they came from very different family backgrounds, different life experiences. They had a common religion and they had had some common experiences together, obviously. But whenever you blend two families, there's always decisions that have to be made about how we're going to continue particular traditions. Are we going to continue to practice the same faith? Are we going to cook the same meals? Are we going to celebrate holidays in the same way? How are we going to, like raise our children? Like there's all these conversations and decisions that have to be made as couples come together to form a new family. And when my sister-in-law came into our family, like I had a ringside seat to how they navigated that as a couple. And one of the things that my sister-in-law has done so, so beautifully that has added to our family culture is she has created a tradition of mealtime intentionality. And so she talks very specifically every night that we're all together for dinner, anytime she's with her children around the table. What was your highlight of the day? What was your low light of the day? What's something you learned this week? When we have birthdays, family birthday dinners, you give your highlight of the day, your low light of the day. And then the additional question is, what's one favorite memory or thing you love about the birthday boy or girl? And then she will, as the mother of most of the children sitting around that table, tell the birth story of the birthday child. Or if it's me or one of my siblings, she'll call our mom and put her on speakerphone. And, I'm 52, almost 53 years old, and I still love hearing my mother tell my birth story because that is my origin story. That is part of my identity. And the little nuances to that start to create family narrative and family culture. So I was born the day after Halloween, and it's All Saints Day. And I am not a saint, but I was born on All Saints Day. And I was born breech, but I wasn't born footling breech. I was born bent in half, butt first. And how painful was that for my mother? She reminds me often about how painful that was. But the joke in the family has become, because we've all heard that story so many times, is that I came early and it was the last time I was early for anything, and that I came butt first, backed into the world, and that I always look at things with a different perspective because of that. So part of the way that we tell these stories starts to build our identity. And it can do the same for our children and our grandchildren. And so who you are in this family and who they are in this family, I think is an important thing that we consider as we tell this stories. Plant yourself in your family tree and don't forget to tell your own stories. I think that that is so, so, so important. So those are the 5 stories that I think every family should know and every family should tell. And as genealogists and family historians, we are in this prime position to, to help craft these family narratives. And National Family History Month is a great time to do that. So I'm gonna I'm gonna be doing all sorts of things for National Family History Month because again, it is kind of my holiday. It's my jam. I want everyone to know their own family stories. I want everyone to take a DNA test and make those connections. I want everyone to start building a family tree so that they have a place to add those stories, to digitize those photos and get them uploaded and preserved and shared. I want everyone to, like in my case, I own the family tree. It lives on my account. I've shared it with both of my parents. They have full editing access. They add information and edit it and update it as they make new discoveries. I've also shared it with all of my siblings. I only gave them viewer access. I didn't give them editor access because they're not interested in doing any of the research or writing any of the stories or uploading any of the photos. But they are interested in what I'm discovering. So I've shared the tree with them. They do not have to have an Ancestry subscription. They mostly just access it on their mobile app because they are using it as a reference or to look something up. But that is the kind of level of interest they have. And so I take my stewardship as the family historian really seriously. And I know that they're interested enough to want the information, even if they're not interested enough to do the work. And I love that I have an audience for the work that I'm doing, for the stories that I've been covering, and for the intentional way in which we are crafting a family narrative that connects us more deeply. So, as you think about ways that you can celebrate National Family History Month this month, I hope that at least one of the ways that you do that is by thinking about these 5 stories and how you can capture that information or discover that information, and then how you can incorporate it or include it into your family tree in such a way that it's preserved, that it outlasts you, and that you can now intentionally share that information. As we head into Thanksgiving next month, as we head into the holidays in December, this is what's top of mind for me is as families gather, I would love it if we had these kinds of stories that we could share with each other. So do one a week, do one a day, pick a person in your family tree and do a deep dive all month into their life and every possible thing you can find about them and craft a narrative about that person. Like there's lots of different ways you can tackle this. So here's what I'd love to hear from you in the comments or in the chat before we go is, did one of these stories spark your imagination or your curiosity more than another? And if it did, do you already know who? Who is it in your tree that has a story that you want to capture? Now, maybe you're one of those people who want to do all of them. If so, let me know. But if you've got a particular one, I would love to hear that. So happy National Family History Month. Please keep sharing. And then we will do a wrap up at the end of October, our final virtual event of the month, because we've got 5 this month, because there's 5 Wednesdays this month. That 5th Wednesday, we are going to do a virtual event where I want you to come back prepared to share. I want us to share our stories, not just with our families, but more with each other as a family history community. Because I think when we do that, we spark each other's imagination and curiosity about what's possible and how we could be more intentional about how we share those things. And if you don't want to wait until the end of the month, by all means, please comment on the Ancestry YouTube channel. You can also find me on social media if you would like to share your stories with me throughout the month. And you can follow along as I share some of my own throughout the month as well. That's all I have for you today. Until next time, I'm Crista Cowan. Have fun climbing your family tree.